something that I started discovering when I got a lot more active on TikTok and on social media was the idea of a aesthetic. And not just an aesthetic that is associated with fashion or something like that. I'm talking about aesthetics that deal with fandoms that are constructed around books and fan fiction. This is actually really interesting news to discover that aesthetics and fandoms are such a thing when it comes to writing. I started thinking about how you can try to strive to create something that is fandom worthy with your writing, and also how to use the idea of an aesthetic to enrich your writing and also to engage much better with your ideal audience. So let's talk about this. What is an aesthetic and what does it mean for your creativity and for your creative output as a writer? Can being a super fan of something also help you to express your creativity as a writer more, or can it hurt you in certain ways? And also, how do you create work of your own in writing that is fandom worthy? i.e., how do you write the next Twilight or Harry Potter, or even something much more unique than that, that will inspire others to be really excited about it? Maybe it takes exploiting the aesthetic or something else, but let's talk about all of these things on today's episode of the How to Be an Author podcast. If you're a writer dreaming of becoming a successful author, join me, writing coach Corinna Akavane, on the How to Be an Author podcast, your weekly source for writing information, inspiration, and motivation. Thank you so much for being here with me on the How to Be an Author podcast. I am writing coach Corinna Akavane. My passion in life is helping writers like you to go from aspiring writer to successful author, no matter where on that whole sliding scale you happen to find yourself right now. And I do this by talking about all things writing skills, as well as mindset and author platform. I believe that writing success is a very holistic thing, and I think it needs to be approached from a bunch of different angles. So let's talk about, first of all, what is a fandom and how does it really kind of associate itself with writing and books? A fandom is a subculture, and it's made up of fans who share a common interest, hence forming a type of social network that can be online or offline. Some of the things that these super fans are going to be geeking out over and bonding over are things like individuals or celebrities or an aesthetic or a hobby, a genre, a fashion, or certain books and movies. And many of these fandoms can be kind of interconnected and they can be kind of different. And how do they express themselves? Well, many of these fans are going to be attending conventions and events such as Comic-Con, WonderCon, DragonCon. They're all different kinds. There is merchandise that is associated with these fandoms, not just books, but t-shirts, coffee cups, and everything in between. There is a certain jargon that some of these fans will adopt. This is sometimes known as fan speak. There's a certain way of dressing and, cosplay. I'm thinking also of kind of the styles such as dark academia. This is a very writing-friendly fandom that can really express itself in the way that these fans are going to dress and where they hang out. They'll be hanging out in bookstores and libraries, wearing a certain type of outfit, and I'm completely here for it. I really love it. There will be discussion boards all over the internet, which is really, really interesting, with people, taking one side or the other. Super fascinating to kind of do a deep dive into that. And then, of course, there is fan fiction. And many of you know that 50 Shades of Grey, which is a hugely successful book, it started out as Twilight fan fiction. And there were fans in the community who were pissed off that it was being used to make money, because fans don't tend to monetize as much as they could or maybe as much as they should. And this is something to think about. And also, when I look at 50 Shades of Grey, I really don't see that it's something that is that much imitation. I see that it's more inspired by Twilight, maybe. And this is also a really important thing to discuss because, fan fiction can be either very similar to the source material or it can be slightly different. And I think this is something that we really need to discuss. Another way that fans express themselves is by making videos, including on TikTok, which is one of the places that many of you have found me. My writing coach persona doesn't so much respond to any kind of fan fiction, but I have done a lot of videos about that. There's also fan art, which can end up being part of your cover design for your book. And then sometimes fan art finds its way into galleries, or it finds its way into places that are a little bit more highfalutin. So super interesting to see how these fandoms really did start off in a literary sense. In fact, the first modern fandom was made up of fans of Sherlock Holmes. This is so interesting. I kind of went down the rabbit hole of this, and I was reading about how people were going into mourning after Sherlock Holmes was kind of killed in 1893. I find this really fascinating, and I'm sure that people in that era were dressing up like Sherlock Holmes. They were probably trying to, solve crimes and things like that, and I kind of love that. So I think some of you think that the fandom subcultures in sci-fi started off with Star Trek, but that's not so. It started off with the literature and comic strips, things like that. I think that's really cool. There is also the fact that media fans really cause things to come back after they were canceled, or they'll cause things like books that were kind of a little bit popular. They'll blow up the popularity so that they can then be made into movies or TV series. And I think this is fascinating. I think that the relationship between fans and professionals has really changed because of the idea of access via social media platforms. So for many of you who are writers who reject the idea of social media and who think that there's no way of really engaging with people on social media and that being on social media doesn't move the needle when it comes to book sales, I beg to differ, especially if you can find a way to engage fans and to figure out how to motivate a fan subculture. Kind of love this. So what are some of the advantages of this whole fan culture, and how does this really help you with your writing, and how does this help you to find more places to have your writing be found and discovered? Think about places like Wattpad. Wattpad is one of those massive platforms for fans to express themselves and to find other fans. And if you're writing some fan stuff on Wattpad, nothing is stopping you from being discovered in your other forms of written expression, but with your fan fiction as kind of this entry drug that, people are going to discover because they're super obsessed with some fandom. That's pretty fun. I think that also when you're part of a fandom, I think that there's probably a lot of support when it comes to creating and sharing work. There's this informal mentorship that starts to happen. And I think that the sense of community and belonging that is intrinsic in this whole idea of fandom, I think that's really helpful to writers who often feel like they're a little bit isolated. I think that it's really interesting to be able to see how some of these superfans are going to be analyzing the meaning of what you write. And also it's going to be helping you to see, how do I create something that has meaning for these sorts of people? And also I feel that for so many of you who feel like you've been shoehorned into a genre and that you feel like maybe there's too much conformity out there, I think that fandoms show that conformity is not so much a thing necessarily, and really it's a safe way to experiment with a new identity, especially if when you are maybe adopting a new pen name. Really deep diving into the whole aesthetic and fandom can be a great way to shape what you're doing and to just go deeper into that whole experience. Okay, but there is, of course, some advantage to fandom, but there's also disadvantages to this whole idea of deep diving into an aesthetic or a fandom. Because remember, fan is fanatic equals a little bit crazy. So there is a divide between fan culture and mainstream society, especially where reading and books are involved, but I really think that so much of Bookstagram and Booktok and all of these book lovers, I think that we happily embrace the weird, and I think this fine. But I know that a lot of writers feel that once they're part of a fandom or an aesthetic, that then there's this lack of originality that happens. There's lots of copying. There's this single focus on one thing, and then maybe a deep knowledge of something that might not matter so much in the greater scheme of things. And some writers have told me that they at first were really excited about a certain aesthetic or subculture, but then once they were in it, they realized that the codes were so strict that in order to keep their fans, they had a really hard time, staying within that, but staying excited and engaged. And you can't really break out because then you're going to be losing that fandom. So that's a little bit hard. I think that there's this, focus on kind of feeding the fans still, and then you can feel like you're now a slave to this idea, creating all this quantity over quality, and that you are kind of having to make up for this lack of creative fulfillment with a focus on all of these fiction-based activities and the likes and the follows. And this is something that definitely happens with any type of social media, but I think it can be a little bit scary to start to think that your fandom or your aesthetic is going to start standing in for your identity. I really don't want you to think that that is the end all be all and that that has to happen. So keep in mind that you need a balance and that you really want to kind of exploit the good things about fandoms and aesthetics, but also you want to keep away from having it be your full identity. So for those of you who have really, thought, okay, I think I can balance all of this, but how do I really write the next Harry Potter or the next Twilight? How am I going to make tons of money and gain tons of fans? This is really, really almost a science, I think. But of course, there's that little part of luck because you don't really know what is the thing that's going to make people fall in love with your character. Right? And in some cases, this passion is really literal. Some people actually identify as fictosexuals, which I think is kind of hilarious. They really grow to have a real emotional attachment for a fictional character. Now, I don't know if you want to go that far with the characters that you're creating, but definitely some people have this very serious problem because this happens all the time. We experience emotions when we read a book. We really do. Even though we know it's fictional, the emotion is real. The connection feels real, right? There's a philosopher named Tamar Gendler who invented this term called a leaf. And this really describes our response to the way things seem. And this is really what applies to writing. Sometimes a character is so well written that they feel absolutely real and you identify with them, and then you start to fantasize about them and all that stuff. And I think that that's something that might make you feel really stupid and you might feel like, oh my God, I don't have a real life. But you just need to be really aware of these feelings. You don't want them to impact your real life negatively or prevent you from having real relationships. But, even writers will fall in love with a character that they're writing because many writers are creating their ideal fantasy. It's so easy to make them perfect since we're the ones writing them. And we don't have to deal with our fictional characters in real life. We don't need to share a bathroom with them. We don't need to see them in their ugly moments. We genuinely can fall in love with this character. And I think that that's a really good sign. When you're falling in love with a character, good job, because if you're falling in love with them, there's a good chance that your reader is going to fall in love with them as well. However, you have to be a little bit careful because psychologically we do kind of bridge this gap and we do tend to write an idealized version of ourselves, the famous Mary Sue. We don't want to be doing that. So you want to make sure that if you're really falling in love with your character and you think they're absolutely perfect for you, you might want to give them a little bit more nuance so that they are that ideal object of one's affection, but that they really do have some more nuance so that there's more for your readers to really hold on to. So how do we write something that's really fandom worthy? Definitely step one is that character, right? Really important for them to have a cool backstory. They need to be nuanced. They need to be unique, flawed, motivated by a noble cause. They need to be a little bit unpredictable, right? But relatable and competent. So you want somebody who's got these strengths, but they also have these relatable weaknesses. And I know that this is something that I say for all main characters, but when you're trying to write someone a little fandom worthy, I think you need to go a little bit more over the top with the backstory and with the attributes of your character. The next thing that really makes people fall in love with your book is definitely the setting. And the setting I always bring up is Hogwarts, for example. Without Hogwarts, do you truly have Harry Potter? Not necessarily. The location is so magical, and it's the attention to detail that really is going to get people going, right? It's those little tiny details that helps some readers to dive in, and also that rewards the readers who are truly paying attention. I think that's really cool. So think about, how do I make my setting really unique? I think that Twilight also has a pretty unique setting. This whole location of Forks, that's a super rainy, depressing area, but the raininess is used for, the logic of the story, that these vampires can be there without being all sparkly day in, day out. They can go to school and, kind of live amongst the population because it's so dark and gloomy there. So that's really, really cool. So definitely I would say, when we talk about this fandom and the aesthetic of the fandom, I've mentioned that this is fashion-based, detail-based, accessories, and costume-based. So this is something that you're going to carry on to your characters in your book as well. And I think it's really great to kind of play with designing this character from the get-go and have either yourself or an artist create renditions of this character so that you really have all of these visual details in mind and that you can express them to your reader. But again, no info dumping, no describing your characters in too much detail all at once, because that gets a little bit heavy. Another thing that you want in your book is you want unique names and language. Nothing that's impossible to pronounce, but something that dives people into the world of your novel. So for this, I'm going to be thinking about Game of Thrones, and they've really created these great languages and great names that are all very logical within their different areas. So if you're living in King's Landing, you're going to be having one type of name, one type of language. If you're living in another place, you're going to have these other sounding names. I think this is really well done. And, Lord of the Rings does this as well. The Elfish language, all of that, really fabulous. I also think of Pirates of the Caribbean, where they have these really well-designed different islands with different characteristics, these different pirates with different backstories and costumes. This is the sort of thing that gets readers really, really exciting. Another thing that you can really do is, for those readers who are paying attention, you want to have these little Easter eggs or little plot secrets in there for them that they're going to notice as they read and reread your book. Another thing that readers love to get really invested in is a great love story. So definitely I would say that if you can have a fantastic, unforgettable, epic love story in your book, that's going to take your readers out of their ordinary lives, and it's going to make them really, really excited to read your book. Now, when it comes to the stylistic writing of your story, most readers who get really invested in a story, they do so because the story is an easy read. So you don't want to be worrying too much about the poetry, except in spots. If you can have a few unforgettable, beautiful quotes that really have the readers relating them to their day-to-day lives within your story, but have that within a basically easy read, I would say that stylistically, that's really the winning combination. I think that's really amazing. Being a storyteller is key, because the quality of your storytelling, the emotion that you can put into your story, is going to make all the difference. You want it to be easy access, but to transcend in some way. And I know that this sounds kind of obvious, but not everybody does this. Sometimes people will create a world and they forget to make it something that's really relatable, that's easily accessible. It becomes a little bit too complex. So remember that a few really interesting details, well placed, will trump too many details that are too difficult to absorb any day. That's really important. So I would say probably the best advice that I could give you if you're trying to create something that's going to inspire a fandom is to look at other books that have done this. Look at other fandoms, look at other trends, and notice what the details are that really get the fans going wild. And then I think that you can definitely see how this works and how you can try to carry that over to your own work. Now, how do you use the fandom and this idea of the aesthetic to enrich your author platform and to get more readers and possible eyeballs on your stuff? I talked about getting an artist to create renderings of your characters, of the world of your novel. Now that you have these materials, use them in as many places as you can. Remember that it takes a long time for people to even notice that you exist and to absorb your message and to kind of get into it. So the more that you can use these visual interpretations of what your novel is about, and in the more different realms you can use that. So, carry it on from things like your website to your Instagram, to Pinterest, to TikTok, to YouTube, and then you can start having merchandise. You can start seeking out other books that have similar aesthetics, because that way you can find who's reading those books and talk about those books and tap into those fans. Because remember, at the beginning of this episode, I talked about how fandoms are interconnected and interrelated. These fans are looking for something else to geek out over, for something to fan out over. So the minute you find a fandom that resembles what you're kind of into, I would say piggyback on that, not in an obnoxious way, not in a copycatting way, but in a way that kind of expands on it and that is going to get people really excited about it. When it comes to your persona as an author, you can adopt this aesthetic as well. I mean, I kind of feel that if you're deep down, let's say that you've adopted this dark academia aesthetic in your writing, I cannot imagine that it wouldn't rub off on you in your day-to-day life. So this helps you to, for example, make videos showing your readers, hey, this is how my character's dressed and this is how I dress in real life and this is where I find these clothes. Or, watch me get ready in a dark academia aesthetic, for example, or watch me attend an event that people with this aesthetic would be into attending, or watch me go to a bookstore and choose some books that go with its aesthetic and that also are books that I've enjoyed as an author who writes this kind of book. So I really think that today, thinking about how to not only create a work that fits into a fandom or that could be worthy of a fandom, but not only writing that book, but also thinking, how can I keep that going in the fandom, and within feeding this fandom, how can I get more people to talk about my book? I think that this is a whole holistic thing that you can do. And I think it's just such a fun way of creating a full package and experience for your readers. I really welcome you reaching out and letting me know what you've done within this sort of a concept. I think that this is something that I'm going to be doing a lot more as I keep promoting my book Written in Stone, and as I keep promoting some books under my pen name. I really am going to do a deep down dive into the products, the locations, the sounds, the playlists, all of that stuff. Really, the sky's the limit when you think about it. And so I welcome your brainstorming and, writing down a gazillion different ways that you can exploit this idea. And you can then create a social media calendar and also think of things that you can incorporate into your writing after the fact as well. Be like, okay, next time I'm going to include this in my next book. I think that with a little practice, you can really create something that is worthy of obsession in your readers. So let me know how you've done this or how you plan on doing this in the future. And if you are a writing coach on demand person, you're going to have some extra materials. I'm going to have a bunch of worksheets for you on how to do this. It's going to be really fun. I'm going to show you some examples of how this is really well done. And I'm going to give you how I go in and I create my character aesthetic in a visual sense, and how I research all of that and create it. So that's going to be really useful for you writing coach on demand people. And if you're not yet a writing coach on demand person, you might want to sign up because it gives you access to your writing coach at least once a week to talk about the things that are getting you stuck and to talk about how you can really move forward with your writing. And if you are considering really taking a deep dive into your writing and getting serious about creating something that is totally fan-worthy in the next 6 months, my course From Idea to Published in 6 months is going to be so useful. And in that course, I have a bunch of the resources that I use to create my aesthetics for my books as well. So that's it. I hope this was really, really helpful to you. And I look forward to being with you next time on the How to Be an Author podcast. If you have any pressing writing-related questions or would like to be featured on the How to Be an Author podcast, please feel free to reach out on my website, creativeandwritingcoach.com.